Thank you again to everyone for joining us virtually here tonight for the book launch of Seth Klein's A Good War. My name is Hannah Muhajarine. I'm with the Manitoba Energy Justice Coalition and Our Time Winnipeg. Before we get started, I would just like to say that those of us who are in Winnipeg are broadcasting today from the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I'd also just like to add that these treaty acknowledgements, which we're all used to by now, are obviously very important, but they should not be a replacement for actually supporting Indigenous fights for sovereignty and for land back. So welcome again to this virtual book launch. We're gathered here tonight to talk about a book that's been called Truly Great by Bill McKibben, The Blueprint for Rapid Societal Transformation by science journalist Zia Tong. Exactly the book we need right now by anti-poverty activist Paul M. Taylor. It's also been called the roadmap out of climate crisis that Canadians have been waiting for. That's from someone named Naomi Klein. Here she is. Not only that, the book is currently the top of the best-selling paperback nonfiction list at McNally Robinson. So well done to us here in Winnipeg. So we're very honored tonight to receive a blessing to start this event off in a good way from grandmother and activist Jerry Shingoos. So over to you, Grandma Shingoos.
Good evening, bonjour, danse. I was offered tobacco, like you see here. Last week, Molly came and offered the tobacco, and it's one of the sacred four medicines, but it's always a gift to the elders receive so that we can give. So I'm giving tonight, and I want to offer words and messages. Before I do the prayer, I like to introduce my spirit names. My spirit names are Sky Woman and Northern Lights Woman, and I come from the Bear Clan, and my warrior spirit is Grandmother Turtle. So, wow, lots, hey. I love my names. So, before I begin the prayer, I have a couple things I wanted to acknowledge, and it's Savannah talked about the acknowledgement of the territory that you're on, and I asked participants to think about that and to acknowledge the territory you're on and what you're walking on. Our people have experienced so many things within the last, since the settlers arrived, and our relationship with the land has always been there. Our connection with the land, and those are our relatives, like the waters, the trees, and the soil, and all those four elements: the water, fire, earth, and wind. Yeah, those are our relatives, and we acknowledge them, and it always presents a pattern every time I come and do these openings, and that's my next message is there's always something going on, like, not Trump's and Biden, but with Joyce in Quebec, the death of an Indigenous woman, and it always seems to be a pattern that whenever I do openings, there's something out there, and I thought about it before coming on to do the blessing, and I wanted to express that hate and racism hurts. It hurts our people. It hurts anybody that's of color, and it hurts me to know another Indigenous woman died because of those systems. So with that, I wanted to acknowledge to the author tonight, Seth, Like, you know, I've researched you, and I know that you have a good heart and good spirit for Mother Earth, and I see that and I know that. So I want to acknowledge that. We are all authors, each one of us, and we need to share those stories and those messages with the younger ones and the ones that are coming after them. So just fulfill that spirit of being your own author. Okay. I want to start the prayer. Abujo, Chinanto, Hishikishkoya, Danishnakas, Waiwaita, Kwaimakwanodam. I come to you in prayer today, grandfathers, grandmothers, grandfathers in the four directions, and to Nokomis Mother Earth, and to our spirit helpers. Like each one of us have those spirit helpers. So I pray to all those seven directions, and I asked that you bring that good energy to this event, that positive energy, bring that exhilaration, that inspiration, that excitement, so that we can put it into action, creators, so that we can continue to protect Mother Earth. She's hurting right now more than she's ever been, and she continues to hurt. So I ask the creator to take care of her. I want to pray for the organizers, like for all the planning that they did here. It must have took a lot of planning to do this, and all the participants that are here. I asked ancestors to be your ancestors, to be with you and walk with you. It's and to make sure that you have listen, and when you listen, you take it here, but also you take it to your heart. Okay, and I'm really honored that say blessings to our ancestors that I'm here tonight to say this blessing, because we all are people of this earth. So I go say Chimney Witch.
Grandma Shingoos, thank you so much for your words and wisdom here with us today. And I see that you're wearing the orange t-shirt. Every child matters, and tomorrow's Orange Shirt Day, and in memory of those who survived and those who passed in the Indian residential school system. And I know that's a journey that you walked on, and that you have done a lot of work in your activism to support others. And so it's a real honor and privilege that you're able to be here and share your wisdom with us here tonight. You're just close by, actually. When I dropped off the tobacco, I was literally around the corner from where we are here at CCPA office. So I just, I'm so grateful I got to see you in person. And I know you have to go to the Bear Clans AGM. So thanks so much for being here with us tonight, and we'll carry your good energy with us in our event. Miigwech. Hi everyone, I'm Molly McCracken. I'm the director of the Manitoba office of the CCPA, and I just wanted to pop on to thank our elder and to thank Hannah for hosting, and all of our panelists and our musicians who are just after me. I won't take very long. And particularly to all of you who are here today to celebrate Seth's book. Seth, you know, when we first talked about this, there's a slight chance he might have come to town, but we're glad we're doing it this way anyway. And I just love the book. It's really chock full of important information and analysis that I think only you could have written. And it's something that we need right now, is this pathway forward. And so I just want to make a link over to the work we're doing here at the Manitoba office in an amazing coalition that Eric Reeder from the Wilderness Committee is a part of, the Manitoba Energy Justice Coalition, Laura Tyler, Climate Change Connection, Kurt Hull, the Green Action Center, Tracy Huckle and her staff, and myself. And it's called Manitoba's Road to Resilience, a community action plan for a fossil fuel-free future. And we've been working on it for about a year, thanks to a grant from the Winnipeg Foundation. And it focuses on 7 areas: building, transportation, food and agriculture. I could give you the whole list. But based on the science and what local experts here in the community and in academia are saying on how we can get to fossil fuel net zero emissions by 2050 and cut our emissions in half by 2030. So I just wanted to flag that for you, and I'll put in the chat our email list that you could sign up with CCPA Manitoba if you're not already there, and then we'll be sending information out about this launch. It'll be sometime probably in November, and then we'll also be doing a lot of animation, community animation online, and so we need your help to get the word out there, because that's the challenge with everything being virtual now. We have to amplify and break through all of the many sources of information that we're all accessing all the time. So I'll just leave it there. And so that's Manitoba's Road to Resilience Community-Based Action Plan coming out later this year. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Decades After Paris, that actually Seth introduced us to. And they're actually 2 musicians who will be performing tonight, and Heather Lynn has a connection to the north end of Winnipeg. Her family is here, so hello, Heather Lynn's family watching tonight. Decades After Paris has drawn local and international attention as they explore the human dynamic in a warming world. Inspired by the marches leading up to COP21, Danton J and Heather Lynn started this group and recorded an album to raise awareness of the Paris climate talks. Through storytelling and a slice of romance, they use music to explore the realities of our new world. So please help me welcome Decades After Paris.
Hi, thanks, Molly.
Yeah, we'll try not to get too romantic this evening unless you ask us to. But for the most part, we just wanted to say really a pleasure to be here. Hello to those of us we know. Hello to new faces. We're actually singing to you today from the southern Vancouver Island in British Columbia. So that's also the traditional territories of Lekwungen speaking people. So that's the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich First Nations. And so we're really looking forward to singing a song about another part of the planet, Paris. So you can see our background is here. So this is a song that takes place. Imagine you're sitting on a patio in Paris and you're wondering about what's going to happen with these international climate talks. Anything else, Danton?
Well, and when we're done, we just have a quick announcement, because we did something special today that we want to tell you about as well. So the song is called Paris Takes the Stage, and if you're thinking we're laying the Paris stick on a little thick, that's too bad. Sorry. Sip on beers from Belgium, counting all the ways that we live a life of plenty. Pour road from an ancient sea, counting all the footprints leading up to what will be. No time for second guessing, reinvent prosperity.
Paris takes the stage again. It's not a show, my friend, it's a pathway or the end. Takes the stage again. It's not a show, my friends, a pathway over the end. 137 years ago we gathered here. Scientific wonder, movement from thin air, window to a future, lost to a familiar fate. The sun still shines above us, and it's not too late. Paris takes the stage again. It's not a show, my friends, a pathway or the end. Paris takes the stage again. It's not a show, my friends, a pathway Salvation may be in there. The first generation to feel the records breaking, the last generation to make history. The first generation to feel the records breaking, the last generation to make history. Paris takes the stage again. It's not a show, my friends, a pathway or the end. Paris takes the stage again. It's not a show, my friends, a pathway or the end. Paris takes the stage again. It's not a show, my friends, a pathway or the end. Paris takes the stage again. It's not a show, my friends, a pathway or the end.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And if you're looking for some new music that's inspired by Seth's book, you can find your way to our YouTube page or social media. I don't know, Seth will be tweeting it out. But we've written a song called Here Comes the Music, and it's absolutely inspired by Seth's good work.
Thank you so much, Decades After Paris. And yeah, definitely check out their new album. Molly just put the link in the chat, so I know I'll definitely be checking that out after this. That was amazing. And also, I hope everyone appreciated the amazing Paris background that Decades After Paris, I'm sure, took a lot of time and care into putting up. So yeah, amazing. Next, I'd like to welcome Sherry Yano. She is with the David Suzuki Foundation, where she is the Energy Transition Manager. She's going to be introducing the man of the hour, Seth Klein, to us.
Great, thanks. Hello, everyone. I'm joining you from the West Coast, where it is actually still sunny out, from the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. So out here at the David Suzuki Foundation, a big part of our climate team works on a program called Charged Up. That's all about engaging and enabling people in communities across Canada to act on the climate crisis. So as you can imagine, we are huge fans of Seth's book. And not just us, everyone at DSF is cheering wildly from the sidelines about a good war. And it's great too to see all of the organizations who have come together to rally behind this book. DSF is but one. And so we're also so grateful to all of you for taking time out of your day to join us this evening and to participate in the chat. So hopefully you'll keep that conversation lively. And one thing we've noticed that you no doubt have noticed as well is how important it is to actually come together like this, especially I think in a pandemic, because it's easy to get disheartened and feel isolated in each of our own worries and concerns. So it's so nice when we get to be with others, with musicians and thinkers, authors, activists, and all of you who care deeply about action on the climate crisis. And as Grandma Shingoos pointed out, on the crippling racism, colonization, and inequity that continues to stand in the way of that better future that we all want. So we are in this together, and these are the moments that nourish us. So let me get on with things. I have the great honor to introduce the person that we all came to hear. Seth Klein was the founding director, BC director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives for over 2 decades, and has taken action to address climate change and inequality since he was a high school student. He's currently an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University and remains a research association with CCPA. So I had the good fortune to travel to a workshop with Seth a little over a year ago, so before COVID. And I remember that we talked about this book a lot of the way there. And it was really inspiring to hear all the thought, the conversations, and the research that he had poured into A Good War. So huge congratulations to you, Seth, for putting this wonderful book out into the world. And with that, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Sherry. That was a lovely introduction. And thank you all so much for attending. You know, I did plan on going to Winnipeg as part of a book tour, and of course that wasn't possible, but it's thrilling to know that you're all here, and I feel you over the ether. If I may, I also want to start with some thank yous. So first, I too want to acknowledge and express my gratitude that while you're all over the province and the lands of many Indigenous nations, like Sherry, I am on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Thank you to Jerry Shingoose for that lovely and touching welcome. I realize land acknowledgements on a virtual event may feel a bit odd, but as I argue in the book, the recognition and assertion of Indigenous rights and title is central to winning this existential fight. And actually, the chapter in the book on Indigenous leadership and the climate mobilization it's actually one of my favorites. Second, thanks to all the organizations that have come together to co-sponsor tonight's event. I'm not going to name you all. Please check them out in the chat and hit the links. But I do want to say a special thank you to my former colleagues at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, my longtime home, for taking on being the lead host for this event. The CCPA folks are the people with whom so many of the ideas in my book were developed, and they've been so supportive of this whole virtual tour, and I'm deeply grateful to them. Third, thank you so much to Decades After Paris for that fabulous musical opener. By the way, I linked to that song of theirs from my website, so you can check it out again from there. I was keen to open with music like that, not just because it's a good way to begin, you know, touching our hearts as well as our heads, but also because it was my hope that we could profile some climate emergency music. One of the chapters in the book deals with how to rally the public. And like every chapter, it starts with lessons from the Second World War. And in the war, arts and entertainment played a crucial role in mobilizing the public. World War II had a popular soundtrack. This climate emergency moment, not yet. But our hope with all of the musical openers on this virtual tour is to start to seed what that soundtrack might be. So thank you so much, Heather and Danton, for kicking that off. And finally, my thanks to all the organizations who provided me with funding to undertake the book project: the McConnell Foundation, the Medcalf Foundation, the Corporate Mapping Project, the David Suzuki Foundation, the BC Teachers Federation, and Simon Fraser University's Urban Studies Program. Okay, so with that done, I'm going to offer some opening comments about the book, and then we'll chat about it a bit. So I hope and think that my book makes an important contribution to this moment, and that it calls on us to adopt an entirely new and different approach to the climate crisis than the one we've been pursuing to date. And while I've endeavored to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis we face, I also hope and believe that you will find it an unusually hopeful book. Sherry showed you the book, but here's what it looks like if you don't have your own copy yet. So, as the title suggests, I am convinced that to confront the climate emergency, a wartime approach is needed. And moreover, that our wartime experience should be embraced as a hopeful story. Now, there's no small irony in me coming to this place. And like many of you, I'm sure, I too wrestle with this analogy. I cut my political teeth in the peace movement. That's actually what brought me to Winnipeg the first time when I was a teenager. I am the child of Vietnam War resistors. That's how I happen to be Canadian. But I am now strongly of the view that climate breakdown requires a new mindset to mobilize all of society, galvanize our politics, and to fundamentally remake our economy. And here's why. I'm going to show you a chart. I'm going to screen share something and show you a chart. If I can just bring it up. Here we go. All right, do you see my chart? Good. So, this is a CCPA sponsored event, so there's got to be a chart. And what I'm showing you here is that despite decades of calls to action, our greenhouse gas emissions are not on a path to stave off a horrific future for our children and future generations. The chart tracks Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back to the year 2000. And what is evident is that in the face of the defining challenge of our time, our politics are simply not rising to the task at hand. And I want to just invite us to let this disturbing chart sink in, and then let all of us agree that what we have been doing is simply not working. We have run out the clock with these distracting debates about incremental changes, but where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we have accomplished precious little. Now, some people might look at a chart like this and think, well, at least it's flatlined, you know, the emissions aren't going up anymore. But to quote the great climate change warrior and founder of 350.org, Bill McKibben, winning slowly on climate is just another way of losing. Politics, as the saying goes, might be all about compromise and the art of the possible, but there's no bargaining with the laws of nature, and nature is now telling us something fierce. The latest example for us here in British Columbia was 2 weeks ago, when for a week our skies were choked with smoke from the forest fires in Western United States. And just as we were sending our children back to school and had been assured that the windows would be open and the kids would be outside, we were in fact ordered to shut our windows and stay indoors. That was the convergence of the crises we face. And so a new approach is needed. We need a wartime mindset and a policy agenda to tackle the climate emergency. That's why I say it is time for a good war. So I'll keep my opening comments short, but I just want to give you a sense of the book. The book, this project began actually as an exploration of how we can align our politics and economy in Canada with what the science says we must urgently do. And it is that. I'd always planned to include a chapter on lessons from the Second World War for rapid transformation, but as I delved into that work, I began to see more and more parallels between our wartime experience and the current crisis, and ultimately decided to structure the entire book around lessons from Canada's Second World War experience. Not because I get all weirdly animated about war, rather it is because I see in the history of our wartime experience a helpful and in fact a hopeful reminder that we have done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across society to confront an existential threat, and in doing so, we have retooled our entire economy twice actually, in the space of a few short years, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert back to peacetime, all in the space of 6 years. So the book explores what wartime scale mobilization could actually mean. Each chapter jumps back and forth in time between stories of what Canada did during the war and what we now face. And in the comparisons, it answers questions like, how has public opinion rallied to support mobilization during the war? And how might it be galvanized again today? What was the role of government, news media, arts and culture? How was social solidarity secured across class, race, and gender? And how can we do that again? How is national unity established across Canada's many provinces with their differing interests? And can we successfully do that again as we move off fossil fuels? How did we collectively transform our economy and marshal all of our resources to produce what was needed? How can we do that again? How did we pay for that transformation? And can we mobilize the necessary finances once again? What supports were offered for returning soldiers? And is there a model there for what a just transition for fossil fuel workers can look like today? What was the role of Indigenous people in the war, and what is it in today's transformation? What was the role of youth and social movements then and now? Importantly, what are the war's cautionary tales, the warnings of things that brought us shame, the internments, the squashing of civil rights, the response to refugees, the things that we don't want to repeat? And critically, what sort of political leadership do we require to see us through challenges like this? And I'll share one important comparison that I make right near the beginning because it gives me some hope, and it's this. Despite Canada's war declaration in September of 1939, it's worth recalling that even as the winds of war gathered and in the late 1930s, our leaders were reluctant to recognize what would ultimately be necessary, a lot like today. Canada was on the cusp of being completely transformed by its Second World War experience, yet right up to the 11th hour, our governments still hope to avoid being dragged into that fight. And so we find ourselves today, right, in this similar awkward period where last summer Justin Trudeau's government passes a climate emergency motion in the House of Commons one day and then proceeds with reapproving the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion the very next day. That is the new climate denialism at play, a concept that I unpack in the book. But as with the Second World War, this phony war is not going to last. I'm convinced it's about to end. The book is an invitation to our political leaders to reflect on the leaders who saw us through the Second World War and consider who they want to be and how they want to be remembered as we undertake this defining task of our lives. And my hope is that the book might embolden them to be more politically daring than we've seen to date, because that's what this moment demands. And much like the trials that tested the character of past generations, the book is also an invitation to all of us to reflect on who we want to be as we together confront this crisis. In the first chapter, just to give you a teaser, I share what I see as some of the key lessons from the Second World War, which I dubbed the battle plan for climate mobilization. It's a 14-point plan outlining what it looks like to adopt an emergency mindset and do what it takes to win. Much of the book deals with the connections between climate action and inequality and argues for why linking these crises is central to winning. And I'll conclude my opening comments with this. Like many of you, as I read the latest scientific warnings, I'm afraid. In particular, I feel deep anxiety about the state of the world that we're leaving our kids and those who will live out throughout most of the rest of this century and beyond. All of us who take seriously these scientific realities wrestle with despair. That is the ambiguous time in which we live. And the truth is, we don't know if we're going to win this fight, if we'll do what we need to do in time. But it is worth appreciating that those who rallied in the face of fascism 80 years ago, likewise, didn't know if they would win. We often forget that there was a good chunk of the war's early years during which the outcome was far from certain. Yet that generation rallied regardless, and in the process surprised themselves by what they were capable of achieving. And I think that's the spirit that we need today. And with that, Hannah, I'm happy to talk with you a little bit more about the book now.
Thanks so much, Seth. And yeah, I really listening to you speak, I really hear that like message of hope and just knowing that there is this this precedent for galvanizing ourselves and getting our act together. I do feel like hopeful listening to you. So yeah, I have a couple of questions to start off with, and then I would encourage people who are listening, and I'm sure have lots of questions for Seth to go ahead and start dropping those in the chat as we're speaking. So Seth, one of the things that I was wondering about, and I appreciate you saying that this is not that you're not a war hawk and that this is not a call to war by any means. But one of the things that I was wondering about is you also write about how neoliberal thinking and assumptions have blocked progress on climate action. And I was wondering, is there a way in which the Second World War and all wars kind of do jive with capitalist growth, with capitalist expansion, that a good war needed to stop climate change might not or should not kind of include that framework or happen within that framework?
Well, there's a lot in your question there, Hannah. Yeah, no, I'm not a war hawk. And much of the book is, to be clear, is specifically focused on the home front, really, and in particular, the ramp up of all of this military production. And as you know, one of the arguments that I'm making is that neoliberalism today operates like this straitjacket, preventing us, including many in the environmental movement, from contemplating what we actually need to do. Like, why aren't we seeing the level of investments and spending that we need to see? Why aren't we creating new crown corporations to actually get this job done? Why isn't this government using the regulatory power of the state to actually drive change instead of just incentivizing and rebating our way towards a solution? And I think the answer to that is that they continue to cling, and so many of us continue to cling to these zombie assumptions of neoliberalism. And in some ways too, that the most insidious legacy of 4 decades of neoliberalism isn't the spending cuts or the tax cuts or the deregulation. It's the sapping of our ambition and the undermining of our collective faith to do something grand together. But here's where I take some solace from the Second World War story. One is that, we didn't call it neoliberalism then, but Mackenzie King was also stuck. Like the Great Depression in Canada in the 30s was more brutal and longer than it needed to be. We didn't get a Green Deal like the Americans had because King couldn't break out of this thinking until the war. And then the war, kind of like we're seeing with the pandemic, suddenly makes all of these things possible that seemed impossible, just in our case, just a few months ago. Your point's well taken that the intertwining of capitalism and war and military production, of course. Although one of the notable things that I found in the research, the private sector had a big role to play in the Second World War. But what it wasn't allowed to do is determine the allocation of scarce resources, because that's not what you do in an emergency. That was all government directed in order to prioritize what had to be done. And as I talk about in the book, like C.D. Howe, who was this pretty right-wing guy actually, but who was in charge of military production in that government, he was so seized with what had to happen. He created 28 crown corporations during World War II. In contrast, Justin Trudeau's only created 2, one of which is the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So just to give you a sense of, an interesting comparison of that possibility. I do think, to answer the last part of your question, that we can do this differently this time, in the same way that the Green New Deal is profoundly different from the original New Deal. First of all, the Green New Deal, like what I'm talking about in the book, links tackling inequality and tackling climate, that a big piece of this is about, in fact, economic redistribution. And by the way, that happened in the war too, right? This promise of a different kind of society was part of mobilizing people. And what I'm actually trying to describe in the book is that as we actually tackle the climate emergency, we're also rebalancing what we decide to do on our own and what we do together. And that a whole bunch of what we currently leave to families to take care of themselves, their childcare, their post-secondary education, their retirement, their parents' elder care, is we say, you know what, chill out, we're gonna do those things together now. And that is part, so when we speak to people, people's economic anxieties about the shift before us, it isn't just about promising more jobs, although it is that. It's also saying you don't actually have to make as much money as you do now because we're going to do things a little differently.
Amazing. Yeah, thanks. That really did answer my question. And I'm seeing that we are having several questions filling the chat. So we have this one from Kurt Hull, and he's pointing out that World War II had events like the invasion of Poland and Pearl Harbor that really served to galvanize action. And he's wondering, what would you say now in 2020, what would a similar galvanizing moment look like today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the things that intrigued me in my study of the Second World War is that feels like, when I started to talk to people about this framework I was using, people would frequently say, oh yeah, but in World War II, everyone understood the enemy, everyone understood the danger, the threat to be clear and present, and everyone was united. Well, actually, that's not true. at the beginning of the war, we were far from united in this. And the threat wasn't clear and present. It was on the other side of two oceans. And it actually took leadership to get the public ultimately where they needed to go, a lot like today. And so, like Kurt is asking, I'm intrigued by this question of what is the combination of leadership and circumstance that kind of shifts the psychology of the public to get that an emergency isn't an emergency. In this pandemic, it's interesting for all of us to remember back in March, what was it when suddenly we were all like, oh, holy smokes, this is different, right? Maybe, I don't know, some people it was probably like the cancellation of the NBA. I think that was one of the defining moments. So, Kurt says the invasion of Poland, but it wasn't the invasion of Poland. In fact, after the invasion of Poland, historians refer to the next 9 months as the phony war, because not a lot happened, and we weren't all into it. I think we're in our phony war period now, in this fight. It was probably more accurate to say it was the fall of France in June of 1940, when the zeitgeist of the Canadian public was like, okay, wait a minute, this is serious. And interestingly, to his point, in the United States, it was Pearl Harbor, it was an attack on their own territory, whereas Canada didn't need that, right? Which is interesting. And I actually have tried in the book to reframe a little bit that I think we should be seeing all these extreme weather events, casting them as attacks on our soil, thinking of them that way. And, so the question in the present is, what's that combination of extreme weather events and scientific warnings and leadership? That's the piece that's been missing, that suddenly shifts the zeitgeist and gets us all there. But the good news I'll shut up after this point, is I think we've already seen a phenomenal shifting of the public opinion terrain in the last 2 years. And I did this original abacus poll work as part of my research for the book. And what you actually see there is a public that's ahead of our politics. That a majority of Canadians now does see the climate crisis as an emergency. And they're ready for bold action in a way that our politics has failed to give them credit for. The student mobilizations, the Indigenous land defense stuff, that just was shifting the terrain and producing a huge amount of momentum up to the point of the pandemic outbreak.
Yeah, and I think that definitely, like what you were just mentioning, like with the fires in the U.S., like that has been so incredibly scary to see, and I'm sure is really bringing the scale of the crisis and the fact that it's here right now. That's just, I think, hitting home for a lot of people if it hadn't before. And yeah, really interesting to think about casting these as attacks that we have to respond to. And I hope that people do start seeing them that way.
I make the point right in the preface of the book. As I was finishing the book, we had all these incredible fires happening in Australia. And interestingly, the government's response to those fires was the largest deployment of military assets in Australia since the Second World War. And this is the awkward moment in which we find ourselves. We mobilize to put fires out, but not to prevent them. And what will a fall of France moment be when when things really start to galvanize for us?
Yeah. I think we have time for maybe just one last question. So I'm just scrolling through them now. Maybe it's something that we haven't really touched on yet is the fact that, of course, Canada is just one country among many. Could you talk a little bit about what you think needs to happen internationally to support climate action? And that's a question from Reiki Stewart.
Yeah, I'm glad that one came up, because I think actually when you talk to Canadians about the need for action, this is a line that one encounters a lot, right? We're only one country, we're small, what we do doesn't really matter. Particularly when the US under Trump seems to be moving in the opposite direction. So the first thing I would say in response to that is, yeah, Canada may be a small country and our emissions may be less than the United States and Europe and China and India, but our per capita emissions are the highest in the world. And that doesn't even count everything Canada extracts and exports, but is burned somewhere else and counts towards their emissions. But we are I believe it's the 4th and 5th largest producers in the world of oil and gas. So we got to tend to our own garden. We are big players here. But that said, we still need the international efforts. One of the initiatives I'm actually involved in right now is this new initiative for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that speaks to the fact that the Paris Agreement doesn't actually mention fossil fuels, courtesy of many years of successful lobbying by the fossil fuel industries. And so we need a parallel treaty on the production side that tackles the supply side. But the book is written mainly to Canadians about what we need to do. And to that voice in the head of so many Canadians that says, oh, we're just small. This, again, is one of the things I love out of our Second World War story. We didn't wait on the Americans then either. We entered the war 2 years earlier. And we didn't require, as I said, an attack on our soil. And for most of those first 2 years, we were the only country in the Western Hemisphere that was engaged. And we were a much smaller country then, only 11 million people. And at the end of the war, nobody questioned the value and importance of what we had done.
Thanks, Seth. And thank you everyone for those questions, and keep them coming. There's gonna be hopefully another chance after we hear from our panel to post some more questions. So please, you can keep posting them in the chat, even as the panel is speaking, as things occur to you. So I'll move on now to introducing our panel. I'll introduce them all together, I guess, and then each one will have your 5 minutes to talk about what the next stage of climate mobilization in Manitoba looks like. So first, we're going to hear from Clayton Thomas-Muller. He's a member of the Treaty 6 nation-based, the Treaty 6-based Matthias-Colomb Cree Nation, also known as Pukatuagan, in northern Manitoba. Based in Winnipeg, Clayton is a senior campaign specialist with 350.org. He has been recognized by Yes Magazine as a climate hero and is featured as one of 10 international human rights defenders in the National Canadian Museum for Human Rights. He has campaigned across Canada, Alaska, and the lower 48 states, organizing in hundreds of First Nations, Alaska Native, and Native American communities to support Indigenous peoples to defend their territories against the encroachment of the fossil fuel industry, with a special focus on stopping the expansion of the Canadian tar sands and its associated pipelines. Clayton is a campaigner, a director, media producer, organizer, facilitator, public speaker, and author on Indigenous rights and environmental and economic justice. So we'll be really excited to hear from him in a moment. Then we're going to hear from Eric Reeder, who is with the Wilderness Committee. He spends his time in the bush across Manitoba, hiking, paddling, and pedaling to investigate how we are caring for nature. With an eye to protecting more wild spaces and wild species, he uses a boots-on-the-ground approach to document the impact of industrial activity in public lands and waters and push for policy and legislative changes. And I'm sure that many people watching have seen his videos. For 14 years, he has been the Wilderness and Water Campaigner for the Wilderness Committee, which is a national people-powered environmental charity that is celebrating 40 years of work in 2020. And then last but certainly not least, we'll hear from Courtney Tosh, who is an 18-year-old member of Manitoba Youth for Climate Action. She is in her first year at the University of Winnipeg in environmental studies, and she has been organizing since February of 2019. She helped to plan youth climate strikes along with other nonviolent actions that promote climate justice. So again, each panelist will be speaking on what does the next stage of climate mobilization look like in Manitoba, starting with Clay. Over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Hannah. Hi, everybody. It's really, really amazing to be a part of this incredible panel and to support the brother Seth's book launch here in Manitoba, the sacred place where Creator sat. Want to acknowledge, of course, this beautiful territory the city of Winnipeg is in, Treaty 1, the Anishinaabe, the Dakota, the Great Métis Nation, and all Indigenous peoples that call Winnipeg, the biggest urban reserve in Canada, home. Just want to acknowledge everybody, and of course all of our ancestors that this great city is built upon, their graves. Definitely want to acknowledge all the other panelists, and of course all the amazing sponsors, especially CCPA and their incredible leader Molly. And thank you, Decades After Paris, for that wonderful song, and Grandma Shingoos for that opening prayer. I guess the comments that I wanted to share right now is that, there is a profound and incredible opportunity that comes with, the COVID pandemic, the ensuing recession that Canada and the world is facing at this moment. And also, of course, this huge existential crisis of climate change. In every speech or talk that I give to people, I'm always quick to acknowledge the fact that, climate change, things like the tar sands and its associated pipeline infrastructure and other infrastructure such as shipping lanes and refineries across Turtle Island attached to this monster industrial development. These are all symptoms of the actual problem, which of course is capitalism. It's the economic paradigm that we find ourselves trapped within that is causing, all of these things that are so overwhelming and that lock us into apathy and freeze us from becoming activated and taking action and hitting the streets and hitting the lands as a defender, as a protector. And, I think that one of the interesting things about the Paris Climate Accord, of which Canada is a signatory of which we are well, we are veering in a completely opposite direction than being able to actually meet our commitments to the Paris Climate Accord, which, fundamentally is essentially a trade agreement, designed to commodify, the last thing left to commodify on Earth, which of course is our atmospheric carbon cycling capacity, and turns things like forests and, other carbon sinks into commodities to be bought and sold on the international carbon trading markets. That's what companies in Canada and Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister, are referring to when they talk about this idea of net zero. A lot of these solutions are false solutions that they're proposing. They're market schemes and trading schemes that don't actually keep the oil in the soil and keep the coal in the hole and so on and so forth. And, that's a big problem when you live in the country, as Seth had mentioned, that has the highest per capita rate of carbon emissions. There's more people in the state of California than there is in all of Canada. But we are home to the largest, highest carbon emitting unconventional oil development on the face of the earth. They move more earth in the tar sands every day than that could fill up the Toronto Sky Dome where the Toronto Blue Jays play. They've moved more earth in the tar sands and, displaced more forest and local communities since its development began than the Great Wall of China, the Suez Canal, the Great Pyramids, and the 10 largest hydroelectric dams on the planet, okay? And so we've got a big responsibility on our shoulders here that, doesn't differentiate based on provincial boundaries. Like here in Manitoba, we've got a lot of land defenders, a lot of water protectors here that, went down to Standing Rock, which is 6 hours south of us across the Medicine Line, and, and stood shoulder to shoulder with land defenders down there. We have many people here that have been fighting Enbridge and their Line 3 tar sands pipeline. Shout out to the White Buffalo Spirit Camp and everybody that's been supporting them all these years. And just across the border, a lot of our allies have been fighting this Line 3 stuff in Wisconsin and Minnesota. Just like pipeline fighters, like land defenders, that have been fighting the Trans Mountain Pipeline. My team at 350 that I'm a part of, honored to be a part of, we are nationalizing the fight against Trans Mountain. And, all of these pipeline fights and fossil fuel infrastructure fights feel very much like a whack-a-mole game. which can get a little overwhelming. And for us, you know, we've kind of taken it to the next step. And I'll end with this note, but essentially, you know, we've launched the Defund TMX campaign, and, you know, we're organizing with local partners here in Manitoba. That's Manitoba Energy Justice Council, and, you know, some of the young people who have been organizing as a part of climate strikes. And basically what we are asking for folks to do is that, you know, all of us are unwilling and unconsenting shareholders in the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which Justin Trudeau, of course, nationalized when we beat Kinder Morgan and sent them back to Texas with their leg between the legs. And now, you know, we have this boondoggle, you know, tens of billions of dollars. We don't even know what the price is right now. We haven't found out yet. But essentially, you know, here in Manitoba and in provinces and territories and First Nations all across the country, you know, we're going to be supporting young organizers, an entirely new cohort of young leaders who have connected the dots between, you know, equity work, between anti-racism work, between taking reconciliation a step forward and actually talking about land back to Indigenous peoples and climate reparations, and put that together into this incredible new type of climate warrior, you know, this new type of land defender, you know, these young people that are organizing across the country that put 1 million people on the streets on September 27th last year for climate strikes. We're living in an unprecedented time. And so, you know, I definitely encourage you to check out the link in the chat for more detailed information about our Defund TMX campaign. You know, we're calling on Chrystia Freeland, Justin Trudeau, and the entire government to walk away from this project and to instead put those resources into infrastructure and programs that create a Made in Canada Green New Deal. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to some questions, and I look forward to hearing the other panelists. Thank you. McNally.
Thank you, Clay. Eric, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm really happy to have an opportunity to speak at this book launch and the work that Seth is doing. And thanks for all the panelists and for Grandma Shingoose for opening us up in a good way. That's a lovely phrase that I've learned from Clayton. I'm in Treaty 1 territory. I'm in Winnipeg, and I'm the Wilderness and Water campaigner for the Wilderness Committee. And as Hannah said, I prefer to be in the bush, which is the work I've done when I started 14 years ago, but I really had to move towards the necessary role in the climate that needed to happen in Manitoba. And I just want to give you an idea of where we've started in Manitoba, sort of kind of ground this. In 2019, as we were going into an election, we had some polling that talked about people in Manitoba were concerned about climate. 70% of them said, yeah, this is this man-made problem. But less than half of the people, this is rural especially, said that this was going to affect them. So this is the place in 2019 where we're going into an election and we've elected another government who is not moving on climate. So that's the place where we were in the fall of 2019. I've forgotten to start my clock, so now I'm going to run over town here. Sorry about that. The things changed in 2020, apart from the pandemic, of course, but 3 major rainfall events caused incredible flooding. The first one in southeastern Manitoba around the Gardenton region. Then there was this unprecedented, of course, that's the term that happens when we discuss weather during the era of climate chaos, but the dam on the Little Saskatchewan River at 11 at night, I think, the government sent out a news release that said they didn't have confidence in the dam, meaning that it was going to collapse and flood the people living downstream from it. So that was the floods in Western Manitoba, and I went on the land afterwards and it was an incredible mess. And then in Northern Manitoba, they dealt with incredible flooding in Paint Lake, and the Grass River system was really well flooded still way into August. So these were disasters that were being declared in rural municipalities around Manitoba, 3 separate ones in 2020. And then in the fall, the government had to say, well, we have emergency disaster assistance funding for these communities. Those pieces are connecting. These are those that Seth was mentioning about these triggers and these wars, and people in Manitoba are seeing it, and the media are discussing the fact that this is a really big deal. And of course, we have to keep saying that this is only the start. So that's the doom part of what I do and bring up and say that I try and draw attention to the fact that this is climate chaos happening right here in Manitoba. So at the climate action team that Molly had talked about, we said, okay, well, where are we really going with this? Like, let's start from the beginning, is that the government has not committed to get to zero emissions. The government has built this little thing called a carbon savings account over 5 years that they're going to lower emissions. And if they don't make it in that year, well, they're going to tack that on to the next 5 years. And if they go on the current pace that they have scheduled, it's going to take 80 years to get towards zero emissions. And of course, that's not enough. So the very first piece in the next mobilization in Manitoba is that we need the government to admit that we are in an emergency and that we need action. And so through the climate action team and through other organizations that we're working with, we'll be putting that out there for Premier Pallister and his progressive conservative government have to say out loud, we're in a climate emergency and we're going to bring Manitoba to zero emissions. Running through time real fast here, but my piece of it, after we get to that point, once we've got the government to admit that we have a problem, we need to start nurturing nature and wilderness in this province. Because after we get to zero emissions, we're going to need to draw down carbon if we're going to have a chance of stabilizing society. This is the next piece. And what Manitoba has, what we have on this land is more wilderness than most jurisdictions in the world. And that's more opportunity to store carbon and to affect the carbon balance. When I say Manitoba has this, the place called Manitoba, this is the traditional territory of 63 First Nations in this land called Manitoba. And the territories of these First Nations encompass the entire province, and that territory is critical for this fight. Now, I mentioned it in the past that I work on protected areas. That's what we're always going for. But what really we're talking about is caring for nature. We need to care for nature in a way that nature takes care of us in a carbon emission cycle. So what we're looking for in this next mobilization is that we need to care for Mother Earth with the 63 First Nations that live here and have lived here since time immemorial. And we have to put an effort here in this province to preserve nature and wilderness. And so the term care is really, really critical. And we have to consciously offer care towards First Nations, which has not happened in the past, because the First Nations who live on this territory live on these territories and have taken care of these territories. Their knowledge is critical for us going forward in Manitoba. So that's a really huge piece. We need to start reconciling the past and ongoing wrongs, which, Grandma Shingoose mentioned the woman who died in the hospital in Montreal, dealing with racism from the staff that's supposed to be caring for her, like the ongoing wrongs. And so while we build this relationship with the people who are caring for the lands and waters, which is, of course, the thing that gets us through this climate emergency, that this is critical, caring and community. And then we begin bridging the conversations between settler and Indigenous divide and between rural and urban divide, and have these conversations about care for ourselves, our community and nature. And in that process, we will recognize that caring for our atmosphere and climate is how we get through this. And I'm sure I'm over time, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric. Courtney, over to you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be speaking today on this panel. And I'm Courtney from Manitoba Youth for Climate Action. And I'm gonna start by giving a very brief history of the strikes in Manitoba if you're not familiar with it. So shortly after Greta started her striking about 2 years ago, in December of 2018, a very small group actually of middle school students in Winnipeg hosted their own strike, and it was probably only about 15 kids. And then every month after that, we had another strike, and I joined in February, and each month more and more people would join these strikes, and they grew each time. And on September 27th of last year, so that's almost a year ago to the day, we had a strike that drew a crowd of almost 15,000 people, which was absolutely incredible. And so I believe that youth climate strikers are a key in the climate movement. And I think that the youth climate strikes have been so important. And it can be very hard to get politicians to listen to activists, especially when they're adults. They brush them aside a lot of the times. But when you have a young person or a child who's making noise about the security of their future, then all of a sudden it's impactful. And we see these massive mobilizations happening because this is an issue that affects all young people, and all young people care about it. And that's how you get these huge groups of people mobilizing. So before I answer the question and talk about what I want future mobilizations to look like, I'm going to talk about what I want to see and what I think other young people probably also want to see. Because we've been raising awareness, we've been striking, we've been rallying, we've been making noise, and so we want the government to listen. And it's time that Trudeau stops buying pipelines. It's time that he stops saying things like he's not going to release a full climate plan until November 2021, which is over a year from now, and it's completely ridiculous. And it's time for us to see Pallister do the things that are so easy and that will help so much by investing in transit and by fixing the sewage treatment plant that needs to be fixed desperately, and by making sure that hydro doesn't impact communities negatively. Those are easy things to do. He can do them. He can do them so easily, and that's what we want to see. But unfortunately, none of this will happen if the youth climate strikers stop and if we stop mobilizing. And we haven't stopped. On September 25th, just a few days ago, there was a big global climate strike where in more than 3,100 places across the world, people striked, and they followed COVID-19 protocols. And many of those places were across Canada. So to answer the question of what's the future mobilization going to look like for the youth, the answer is you're going to see more of what you've already seen. You're going to see more of us doing strikes, rallies, more campaigns, more trademarking of conservative logos like Take Back Canada. That was pretty cool. And you're going to see more of it. And we're not going to stop because stopping is simply not an option for us. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to show up when we mobilize and we organize these events. Show up when we ask you to, and also vote. And when you do vote, vote for the right people, which I'm sure you all will if you're watching this and if you're attending this event. And I think that is all I have to say. I look forward to questions, and thank you.
Thanks, Courtney, so much. And thanks to all of our panelists, to Eric and Clayton as well, for that kind of national, provincial, and then also a deep look at the climate strikes. I think that really fleshed out what's going on in Canada right now, this current moment, as well as what's happening in Manitoba as well, and how this all ties in to the ideas that Seth is putting forward. Seth, I know that you said that you did want a few minutes to respond to the panel. I'm wondering if you want to do that now, or if you want to do a few questions first.
Well, I do want to respond to the panel. I'm looking at the clock. I mean, if people have a question of the panel before I do, that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, well, there's definitely been lots still coming through for the chat. So one of the ones that I thought was kind of interesting, that I think that maybe the panel could speak to, is Sandra McEwing is asking about, I think this was when Seth was talking about some of the climate attitude numbers. So like how many Canadians are in favor of some form of climate action. This is something that also the panelists touched on too, of course. And she's wondering, what about, like, is there this divide that we hear so much about in between the central and western provinces? You know, we're hearing a lot about Western alienation from Jason Kenney and other Western politicians. So I'm wondering if maybe first I'll ask, do any of the panelists want to speak to this idea that there's less support perhaps for climate action in the prairies?
And if they don't, I'm happy to pop in on
No, I think there's a lot of propaganda out there, you know, including, you know, that directly invested with taxpayers' dollars by the Kenney government in the province of Alberta. I mean, the Premier of Saskatchewan is, and our own Premier here in Manitoba. You know, these are all people that were part of this kind of climate science denial photo in the Globe and Mail, you know, and essentially have invested, you know, in Alberta, they've invested, I think it was 25 million into a war room to deal with activists and indigenous peoples fighting against the expansion of the oil sector there, and just trying to get big oil to clean up their legacy of mess in that province. That in and of itself, you know, remediating the tar sands, remediating the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of oil and gas wells that have been left completely like non-plugged, that are just belching methane gas, you know, a gas 25 times more potent than CO2 into the atmosphere, just nonstop. I mean, these things need to be cleaned up. And a lot of the companies that made those messes have declared bankruptcy, or they were foreign entities and have left. They were working through a number of shell companies, and it's just a real big mess. And, you know, Kenney, you know, has even passed draconian legislation in Alberta called Bill 1, which actually promises jail time and fines in the thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars for anybody who is charged with, you know, blocking the oil sector's wishes through, you know, the democratic right to protest and you know, practice dissent, essentially. And so, you know, I think that the most important thing for people to remember is that oil companies operating in the Alberta tar sands, even with the tens of thousands of workers who have been laid off, are still posting record profits. Okay, they're making more money than they've ever made before, and they're pointing fingers at First Nations, they're pointing fingers at environmentalists, and they're trying to take a page right out of Trump's book and say that, you know, we're eco-terrorists or something. When the fact of the matter is that industry's automating itself. You know, the reason that there are always, you know, fires and different kinds of things happening, workers getting killed, including temporary foreign workers, are because they are operating at the bare minimum line, and worker safety, concern about the environment, trampling of indigenous people's rights, the poisoning of the biggest watershed in North America, the Mackenzie River Basin. You know, all of these things are just secondary. They don't care, okay? And they will lay off workers every chance they get, automate jobs, and blame everybody else. It's a whole denial, dupe, and delay system that they have to try and dupe the Canadian public into thinking that, you know, big oil and the tar sands is like the most fundamental part of our economy, when in fact, it really isn't.
So maybe I can weigh in on this, the public opinion and polling question, and whether or not, you know, what kind of difference do we see across the country. So when I was doing research for the book, I interviewed a lot of politicians and political insiders, and I wasn't interested in interviewing climate deniers and, you know, people who are just uninterested in this. I was specifically interested in interviewing politicians who claim to get it and yet who aren't doing what we have to do. And when you interview those people, in one way or another, they almost all fall back on some variation of the line, well, you got to meet the public where they're at, and they're not there yet, which made me want to do this poll to find out if that was true. And so I commissioned this major national poll from Abacus last summer. And, you know, the big takeaway was the politicians were wrong. They weren't giving the public credit. The public was there. They saw it as an emergency. They were willing, they were ready to take bold action. And when you break those results down across the country, as you might expect, the support for bold climate action ranges from a high in Quebec to a low in Alberta. But even in Alberta, the support was remarkably strong. Like, just to give you one example, 50% of Albertans said they were ready to support or accept ending the extraction and export of fossil fuels over the next 20, 30 to 30 years. So I think it's really important for us not to let the likes of Jason Kenney define the political culture of a place like Alberta, and not to paint them with one broad brush. But I also, in the book, try to say, we do need to make a real offer to Alberta. Like, Alberta has a challenge. 38% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions are from Alberta, way more than their share of the population, which means that in the transition ahead, they got a lot of heavy lifting to do, and so does Saskatchewan. So, and they've heard a lot of hollow promises over the years about just transition, and nothing happens. And so the argument I'm making is there should be an audacious new federal transfer. I would call it a climate emergency just transition transfer. Big, $20 to $40 billion. But unlike most federal transfers that divvy the money up by population, let's divvy it up by GHG emissions. So if Alberta has 38% of the emissions, send them 38% of the money. But don't send it to Jason Kenney, because as Clay points out, he's not to be trusted. Let's create new just transition agencies in each province, governed by the feds, the municipalities, Indigenous nations, labor, climate experts, and let each province figure out where to spend that money best in terms of expediting climate investments and transition and retraining. I see the clock is coming down. If I may, I'd like to just, well, first of all, I just want to say thank you to the panelists. And you're all people I really admire. Like, you're leaders in the areas of Indigenous action to block fossil fuel expansion and in youth and student mobilizations. And this is what we need right now. And Courtney said, we need you to support us when we're doing this. And she's absolutely right. I think I saw David Camfield in the chat saying, we need this pressure from below, and you're absolutely right. That was true in the days I write about in the book as well. There's this famous quote from Franklin Roosevelt, where before the New Deal came, and he has a group of community and labor activists in his office telling me what he has to do. And he finally ends the meeting and says, okay, you've convinced me, now go out there and make me do it. So I think those student mobilizations that Courtney talked about and the Indigenous land defense actions that we have seen over and over, and this is what I try to detail in the book, in this space that we're in, this phony war that we're in, where our politics, our mainstream politics, dithers and dodges on climate and has so much confusion, over and over and over again, Indigenous actions are buying us time, blocking fossil fuel infrastructure projects until such time as our politics aligns itself with the climate emergency. And I think civil disobedience is a piece of that. I want to build on what Courtney said for a moment, because I find the student and youth mobilization so inspiring. They have changed the landscape for sure. And I want to share a story that I have in the book. The whole climate fight has become so weaponized in our politics, right? And it's become such a wedge issue federally and provincially in so many places, but not every place. So my wife's the city councilor here in Vancouver. She's the city councilor, Christine Boyle, who introduced the climate emergency motion a year and a half ago, which was the first in English Canada. Quebec had already done it. You guys in Manitoba, of course, don't follow Vancouver politics. Why should you? But let me just tell you, it's a bit of a mess. No political party has a majority. You never know how this gang's going to vote on anything. And Chris is all alone in her party. And she brings this climate emergency motion forward. And not only did it passed unanimously. And it tasked the staff with to make it real. They had 90 days to come up with a new city action plan that would align the city with the IPCC targets. It had bold measures that are among the boldest in North America. So for example, this is what I mean about shifting to emergency mindset. In Vancouver now, out of that plan, as of next year, no new buildings will be able to tie into natural gas for space and water heating, right? That's huge. That's not about incentivizing change, that's about requiring it. And when that bold plan came back 90 days later, it again passed unanimously. Across the political spectrum, we have a bunch of right-wing city councilors in there. Now, how did that happen? Now, partly it happened because Chris is really good at her job. But she would say that the reason why it happened is because of the students who skipped school, who rallied outside, who spoke in front of the council, who filled the galleries each time the vote happened and watched. And in this moment of intergenerational reckoning, they made it politically impossible for those councillors to vote no. That's what we need to try to replicate across the country. And let me close with this. I think with this pandemic moment we found ourselves in, it actually sets us up for what we now need to do. We now have had this reminder of what an emergency looks and sounds and feels like when a government actually gets it. The level of social solidarity is at a generational high. The level of national unity in some ways is at a generational high. We have new respect for science and scientists out of this pandemic, a new appreciation of the role of government and the importance of public services, and now a lot of clarity that the economic recovery is going to have to be state-led. And the only debate that we now need to fight out is what form will that take? Will it be investment into the rebuilding the old, or will this catapult us into the new? It is an emergency. Emergencies that we've all experienced in this pandemic need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. And we need our federal government in particular to stop trying to appease the oil industry that's trying to block action. We need to make the most of this federal minority moment. That's what I love about what I see 350 and the Our Time crew doing, really trying to make the most of this minority federal moment. We need to seize on this pandemic moment and this broader emergency moment to sound the alarm however we can, to demand that both our federal and provincial governments adopt a true climate emergency plan and an audacious Green New Deal. And I think we can do so knowing, both from our wartime experience and now our pandemic experience, that when we adopt an emergency mindset, the scale and speed of what we can do is spectacular. I'll close with this. I'll close with something I note in the book's conclusion. And I know it's a little nerdy, okay? So few of us on this webinar tonight, I suspect, were alive in World War II. But a lot of us, the nerds among us, you know, we look back at these pivotal times and we ask ourselves, what would I have done if I had lived then and there? The answer to that question is actually no great mystery. The answer to that question, friends, is whatever we're all ready to do now. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Seth, and thanks to our panelists, thanks to our musicians and everyone who made this run smoothly. Thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us here virtually tonight. I know that I'm feeling really inspired and ready to think about what we talked here tonight, to think about the ideas in Seth's book and ready to take action. And I hope that everyone feels that way too. Thanks everyone, and have a good night.